There was a time when going to the movies felt different, in a way that most people today don't even think about. It wasn't just about sitting in a dark room and watching a screen. It was an experience built on something physical, something mechanical, something happening behind the scenes that you never saw, but always depended on, because every film you watched, every scene, every frame passed through the hands of someone whose job was to make sure it all worked perfectly. Someone sitting in a small room above or behind the theater, surrounded by machines, reels, light, and heat. Someone who controlled the entire experience without ever being seen. The film projectionist. And for decades, this wasn't just a job. It was a critical role in the movie industry. Something every theater relied on. Something audiences never questioned. And then, almost without warning, that role began to disappear. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, until most theaters no longer needed it at all. So, what actually happened to film projectionists? And how did such an essential profession fade away so completely? To understand that, you have to go back to how movies used to work before everything became digital, before files replaced reels, before automation replaced human control. Back to a time when films were physical objects, large, heavy reels of film that had to be transported, handled, and carefully prepared before they could ever be shown on a screen. Every movie arrived at the theater in multiple reels, each one containing a portion of the film, and it was the projectionist's job to take those separate pieces and prepare them for a seamless viewing experience. This process required precision and attention. Reels had to be inspected for damage, cleaned, and then assembled in the correct order, sometimes spliced together into a single continuous reel, sometimes loaded individually depending on the system. And once the film was ready, it had to be threaded through the projector, a complex path of rollers, gears, and gates that guided the film frame by frame past a powerful light source, projecting each image onto the screen at high speed. If anything went wrong, if the film slipped, broke, or jammed, the audience would see it instantly, flickering images, sudden stops, even complete silence. And that's why projectionists had to stay alert at all times, monitoring the equipment, listening for unusual sounds, watching for signs of trouble, ready to act within seconds if something failed. The job wasn't just technical. It required experience, focus, and a deep understanding of how the machines worked, because every theater was slightly different. Every projector had its own quirks, and every film could behave differently depending on its condition and beyond the mechanics. There was timing. Films had to start at the right moment. Transitions between reels had to be seamless, sometimes requiring manual switching between projectors, using small visual cues on the film itself to know exactly when to change. If done correctly, the audience never noticed. If done poorly, it broke the illusion. And for many years this system worked. It was reliable. It was trusted. And it created the movie-going experience people remember. The slight flicker of film, the warmth of the image, the subtle imperfections that made each screening feel real, but like many industries built on physical processes. It had limitations. Film reels were heavy and expensive to produce, transport, and maintain. They could wear out over time, collecting scratches, dust, and damage with each screening. Distribution required shipping physical copies to every theater. And managing those copies was a logistical challenge. And then slowly, something new began to appear: digital projection. At first, it didn't seem like a serious replacement. Early digital systems were expensive, and many theaters were hesitant to switch. Film was familiar, proven, and already deeply integrated into the industry. But digital technology improved quickly. Image quality increased. Storage became cheaper, and distribution became dramatically easier. Instead of shipping heavy reels, movies could be delivered as digital files, reducing costs and simplifying logistics. And perhaps the biggest change of all, digital projection didn't require the same level of manual operation. Once a film was loaded into the system, much of the process could be automated: start times, playback, even scheduling could be controlled with software. And that changed everything. Theaters no longer needed someone constantly monitoring the projection booth. No longer needed someone to physically handle film, splice reels, or manage complex mechanical systems. The role that once required skill and attention began to shrink. Some projectionists adapted, learning to operate digital systems. But those systems required fewer people, less oversight, and less hands-on work. And as more theaters made the transition, the demand for traditional projectionists dropped rapidly. Large cinema chains moved first, converting multiple locations to digital projection to reduce costs and increase efficiency. Smaller independent theaters followed when they could, often forced by the industry as film distribution declined, because once studios stopped producing physical film copies at scale, theaters had little choice but to switch. And within a relatively short period of time, an entire profession that had existed for decades was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Projection booths that once housed complex machinery became quieter, simpler, sometimes even empty, and the people who once worked there were no longer needed in the same way. But the story doesn't end there, because something else changed along with the technology: the experience itself. Digital projection removed many of the imperfections of film. No scratches, no flicker, no degradation over time. Every screening looked the same: clean, consistent, predictable, and for many people that was an improvement. But for others, something was lost. The physicality of film. The sense that something real was happening behind the scenes. The knowledge that a person was there, making sure everything worked, adjusting, fixing, controlling the experience in real time. Today, a small number of projectionists still exist, mostly in specialized theaters, film festivals, or venues that continue to show movies on traditional film for artistic or historical reasons. For these places, projection is not just a technical task, it's part of the art, part of the experience. But for the vast majority of theaters, that role is no longer necessary. It has been replaced by software, automation, and digital systems that run quietly in the background. What makes this story interesting is how quietly the transition happened. There was no single moment when projectionists disappeared, no clear ending, just a gradual shift. Year after year, fewer film screenings, fewer projectionists, less need for the skills that once defined the job, until one day, most people stopped thinking about it entirely. And that's how professions disappear. Not because they were unimportant, but because the systems around them changed. Because something faster, easier, and more efficient took their place. And in the process, something human, something hands-on, something once essential, faded into the background, almost unnoticed, just like the light passing through a strip of film, gone as soon as it appears.